Welcome to the Bells I Hear podcast, a space for real conversations about homelessness and housing insecurity with people who know the issue firsthand, from advocates and community leaders to those with lived experiences. In each episode, we will speak with experts who will debunk the myths and misconceptions surrounding homelessness and highlight the innovative approaches for addressing the issues, causes, and consequences of housing insecurity. I am Elisa Smith, your host, a mentor, professor of legal studies, and former public defender. Thanks for tuning in to The Bells I Hear. Welcome to The Bells I Hear. I'm Elisa Smith, and today we're talking about long-term solutions to housing affordability, insecurity, and homelessness with Cupid Alexander, the chief of the City of Oakland, California's Office of Homeless Solutions. Mr. Alexander has designed, operated, and scaled affordable housing and homelessness response systems in major U.S. cities. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Alexander. I want to dive right in to talk about the current situation. Are we actually in a housing crisis right now?
Yes, absolutely. But I think there are layers that we have to understand within this crisis. We can go into them, but at a high level, let me give you a little bit of what I see as part of our housing crisis. So some of the individuals in the United States and a lot of our cities, both in rural and suburban and urban areas, there's a level of housing insecurity. So housing insecurity means housing instability. Someone may technically have shelter tonight, but still at risk of displacement. Housing insecurity could mean that you see with the resources that you have that you're simply not going to be able to make that rent payment, and you know it's coming. You can feel it down in your heart. There's also housing unaffordability. So there are tons and tons and millions of families are just rent burdened. In fact, HUD's 2025 worst case housing needs report found roughly 8.46 million very low income renter households facing severe affordability challenges. And when I say that, what I mean is that over 30% of your income is being used, your family income, not just your personal income, your total family income is used to pay for your rent payments. So a lot more families are going into housing unaffordability. And of course, we'll talk about homelessness a little bit because I think that that's one of the generational challenges of our times. But when we talk about homelessness, I'll talk about some of the stats that we're seeing. But I wanted to give a little bit of a framework because it hits so many families that just because you're not homeless doesn't mean that you're not housing insecure.
Right. And isn't there's some difficulty in actually counting who's homeless, who's not homeless,
Mhm.
and how we even develop those numbers?
Yeah, so what you're mentioning is a point in time count. And in fact, here in Alameda County and in the city of Oakland, is within Alameda County, there was the point in time count. And what you're speaking to is the methodology, which is really tough. I still support the point in time count, but we know that it's an undercount just because it's difficult to count every single person. So in one of the coldest nights in January, usually around the last week in January, you have either a 1 day or 2 day count, usually early in the morning, late at night, you get a lot of volunteers, and then you go out and you do this count. So that count is not going to be perfect, but it's going to be darn good in using it to assess where we're at, how many individuals are unhoused, because in our systems, we track individuals if they receive services. If you do not receive services, we do not have information on you that we can put into the system. And frankly, some individuals do not want to be put into a system, but that doesn't mean that they don't need services. So the point in time count is trying to bridge that gap to give that estimate.
Right. And it's not counting this unaffordability issue where you have, some people might be living with multiple roommates in an apartment because they can't
Yeah.
afford, or they're couch surfing or something like that, that there's this because they just simply can't afford their rent, or they're struggling because they are paying much more
Yeah.
than 30%. I think I saw a statistic the other day that said some people are paying like 70% of
Yes,
their
absolutely.
family incomes just for rent.
Absolutely. And there is no one single repository towards understanding the amount of money that individuals are paying, whether they're rent burdened or whether they're not rent burdened. So there is no one single census, or there's not one single database with this information in there. This is why you see so many different communities have different segments of information that they're going to be gathering to assess the need. And honestly, there are some families who are just struggling through it, and they're going to say, you know what, I've made these decisions. I'm going to continue moving forward. I'm going to try and accept as minimal help, or they are receiving help from loved ones and family members. And that's information that's not being gathered because the families are handling it themselves, but it doesn't eliminate the need.
No. And so I guess going back to the first question is this a housing crisis? Can we even answer that question adequately if there's not enough data or resources available to capture how nuanced this issue is?
And yes, and we can answer that question and we can say, yes, absolutely, right? Because we may be missing some information, but with the information we have, it shows that there are a lot of families. Like I said, HUD's 2025 Worst Case Housing Needs Report found roughly 8.46 million very low income renter households facing severe affordability challenges. I don't think we need more information than that to know that there are large sections of and segments of our population that need the help that we are discussing today.
So is this a new problem or is this an entrenched problem?
Yeah, and this is the hard part. This didn't emerge overnight. I mean, it reflects decades of policy choices. Some of the historical drivers that we might talk about are urban renewal and exclusionary zoning and highway construction through certain communities and underinvestment in Black and Latino neighborhoods and low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods that might have individuals who are coming from other countries, whether they're coming from European countries, African countries, Asian countries. You see this lack of investment historically, and those lack of investments, you've seen them move forward. So people are like, well, how does it move forward, right? The decisions that we make, when you can just Google some of this information, you'll see where highways were put, but then the replacement housing was never built. That's the thing. It's not that these highways were just built. It's that there was never that replacement of the housing. And then you lose some of the, what we call NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing, right? So you see some of the housing not being replaced, and then wage growth failing to keep up with the pace of housing costs. So some people are becoming poorer in place. They've always been working. They've always been someone who's accountable. They've paid their taxes. And the escalation of their income is not keeping up with the escalation of the cost of housing due to repairs of housing, due to the demand on housing. And we live in a society where, unless your community has some limits on it, you can raise the rent. And some people, that's in keeping up with the competitive market. And, one of the things I can't avoid, especially being here in Oakland, is that there has been a disconnection with how we invest in certain communities. So you'll see that in the 60s, you see that in the 70s, it's where are we putting our dollars to make sure that individuals of all backgrounds have the opportunity. And so I do want to call that out because I think that is something that sits heavy with a lot of people. And as a practitioner, you wrestle with that because you see the impact of history either repeating itself or you having to go back and fix decades of policy choices where there were certain communities that were just not invested in. And a lot of these communities still exist today.
Right. And then I think there's the other issue, and you may have touched on this, that when we go into these communities and they get gentrified, then people are displaced and they no longer can afford to live in the community where they may have lived, um, grandparents, great grandparents, and then they end up having to leave because
Right.
things have built up around them and they're not uh, providing affordable housing for those individuals. And so they're being
Right.
forced to leave their own communities.
Right. And I think that, and I want to come from the angle of answering the skeptics, right? So the
Mhm.
skeptics would say, this is neighborhood change. This is the economy of our world. And what I would say to that is that we have safeguards. If you think about in business environments, we have anti-monopoly clauses. We have frameworks to help stabilize our communities because they are the bedrock of our cities. Cities are made up of communities. And so when some of these things happen, it's because there is investment, sometimes it's the framework of governance. If you look at urban renewal, and if you look at also what urban renewal agencies use, which is something that is a delayed tax. So they'll say, hey, we're going to invest here and we expect the neighborhood to get better. And as the income grows in that neighborhood, the taxation grows. And the people who are there saying, well, we weren't paying that much in taxes because we didn't have that much to tax. And so the expectation is, are we no longer going to be here? Because who is going to be paying the increase in tax? And that's how it's incentivized. And that's how people see gentrification, right? They're saying, okay, I'm not here to stay. But you've seen a lot of communities more recently talk about anti-displacement. So it's like, how do I make new friends but keep the old? One is silver, the other's gold. But how do we stabilize our communities? And what that is an intentional conversation about the challenges people have in paying rent and finding resources so you can bring in new partners, but you don't have to have the individuals leave that community and they can enjoy the improvement there. So we have seen gentrification, but you've seen a lot of communities start having honest conversations. And one area that we have not focused on, but is going to be big, is the greatest generation, the largest generation. I call them the silver tsunami of individuals who are going to be retiring, right?
Hmm.
That is going to be huge in America. One of the largest generations that have one of the largest amounts of wealth are going to go in to making less money due to retirement than they were. And we have to plan for these things. They
Right.
are homeowners. They are individuals who are going to be paying rent right now. They're not going to be able to afford that same level of rent or mortgage, and they're going to have other expenses that they want to pay for, healthcare, travel, their family expenses. So I think even as we have these conversations about gentrification, affordability, one of the things that we need to look at is we have an aging demographic and a very large population of that aging demographic of all races and backgrounds. And that is going to be one of our next challenges.
Yeah. And there'll be people who downsize, their homes.
Downsize.
And, I think it's something you need to plan for in advance. You don't wait for it to happen and then go, oh,
Yeah.
now what do we do? Right. And I think that leads to your new role.
Yeah.
So you are the chief of the Office of Homeless Solutions.
Hmm.
And it's my understanding that the mayor of Oakland created this office. I'd like to know why she did that, why she thought that was important, and how is this office different than
Yeah.
other offices throughout the country that are trying to address these issues?
Right. So let me take one step back. Thank you for framing that. So the mayor of Oakland, Mayor Barbara Lee, saw something. So the creation of Oakland's Office of Homeless Solutions reflects a recognition that homelessness is not a single department issue. It's a systems issue. If you all have read James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the levels of your systems. So, in looking at this, historically, cities have treated homelessness through a bit of a fragmented response. So, outreach in one department, sanitation in another, housing elsewhere, behavioral health at the county level, and public safety responding operationally in like real time. So, the city is still responding, the county is still responding, the state is still responding. Our office is designed to coordinate those systems into a unified operational strategy. So that's my goal. We do have a strategy, homelessness solutions action plan, which is predicated around 5 deliverables. The primary one being delivering more long-term housing and increasing the shelter supply in the interim until the long-term housing is built. And that's really what is the premise of this office. We also have an encampment abatement policy, how we engage with individuals who happen to be unhoused, whether they accept the offer of shelter or not. They are still residents within the jurisdiction of the city of Oakland, and we have a responsibility to them. And so the mayor here, the city council here takes that very, very seriously. And so how we framed and outlined that is through those plans. And this office helps coordinate, unify, and operationalize strategies. And then I interact with the state, the county, the feds, and making sure that we are delivering across our departments what we need to deliver.
Wow. So have there been any barriers to this work? It sounds complicated.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of different stakeholders
Mhm.
that need to be involved. Have there been any barriers to working together to serve the needs of the community?
I don't know if I would say barriers versus us having intentional conversations on ways that we can coordinate the work that we're doing. So let me give you an example. Here in the city of Oakland, we are within Alameda County. Our point in time count just came out earlier yesterday, and we used to be 58% of the entire homeless population for the county. Now we are 54%. As we're moving forward, what coordination looks like in making progress means that we have to meet with the county, that we have to meet with some of our other city partners that are like to the city next to us. You think about Berkeley, where University of California, Berkeley is. You think about Hayward and San Leandro and all these other cities that are next to us in coordinating our response. We have a robust group of nonprofit providers. We have community activists who are concerned about the livelihoods and the lived experience of those. We have those with lived experience. We have the public health systems. We have housing developers. We have community stakeholders. And then we have the residents here within the city of Oakland. All of those different groups want to understand, how can we work together? What does progress look like? So in this work, we are defining what that is. And then we are also indicating what measurable system performance is. So it's really saying, how do we take the words and operationalize them in ways that you can respect? Because there are no moral victories in this work, right? So we go from prevention to outreach. We talk about interim housing, permanent housing pathways, data transparency, and more importantly, accountability. A lot of people say, hey, how can I hold you accountable? I say, I hold myself even more accountable. And I will be honest, because we are within a finite framework of resources. So we have to identify escalation pathways, what we're going to prioritize. And that is very much a community conversation, because even though this is talking about housing, we're more importantly talking about community development. How are we going to have a higher quality of life for everyone near us, everyone within our jurisdiction, everyone within our county, everyone within our state, and ultimately everyone within our country?
Yeah. And how have the people in the community that you are trying to serve, have they been receptive to this systemic change, or have there been some barriers? Maybe there are policy barriers to pursuing these this kind of an ecosystem approach.
I will say this much. There has not been a person I've met that does not care. How they care might be a little bit different, but do they care? I mean, your listeners will know, and anyone watching this, you bring up this conversation, they're like, grab your drink of choice. I have some thoughts for you. What I've done is I have tried to engage with people, because when we start having this conversation, it usually breaks down into several subject areas. And I'll give you an example of some of the subject areas, because it's a very emotional response people have. And I respect that, right? It's a very like historical response that people have. They will say, I remember when, and it felt different. But when we have this conversation, it usually goes into public safety or education, or the healthcare system, the mental health care system, the workforce productivity. Some people say the neighborhood vitality and the neighborhood quality of life has changed. Some say it's a societal issue, right? And they'll indicate policies upstream. They'll indicate policies downstream. They will say housing policy. They will say planning policy and setbacks for how much building, how much density can we get. Some people will say it reflects the health of the society. And then, I think at the end of the day, a lot of community members, whether it's for them or a retiring family member, they will have this one unifying thing. Most Americans are closer to housing instability than we think. And they'll give you examples of their son, their daughter, themselves, their parents, their grandparents, their friend, their neighbor, their former neighbor who can't afford to live anywhere. And now they have a super commute. And a super commute in most urban areas is that you have to commute an hour or more to get to and they say drive until where you can afford to buy, to rent, to purchase. And so that has been an ongoing challenge. And that is a part of the community development conversation and the quality of life conversation that we aim to have. And the small part that we hold is that we specifically focus on the unsheltered population and getting them connected to long-term housing, which is why I'm here with you today.
Right. So that it's not a Band-Aid. It's a real solution to this issue.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there are some policies that impede the ability to um, address some of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
For example, a college student going off to college and then makes too much money and can't go home because there were limits on housing, or people, I think you call it poverty math,
Mm-hmm.
that are trying to stay just below a threshold so they can't actually get ahead. Can you talk a little bit about some of those kind of, in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
crazy mathematical gymnastics that people are
Right.
doing?
Right. Look, I'm going to be honest. The reason why I called it poverty math, it was my way of describing how expensive it is to be poor in America and the challenges people have and the ways that they think about how they're going to remain viable within the system. I'll give you an example. For a long time, I worked at housing authorities. And at a housing authority, for those who aren't familiar, it's the Section 8 program. It's where there is an assistance to someone's income. But in that income, they have to do an analysis. And in the analysis, it takes into consideration everyone in the household's income. So when some family members felt like they were getting close to being above the threshold, instead of working, they would say, well, I'm going to hold off. I'm going to quit my job for a while because the value of this assistance is more than the value of an unsure marketplace. And that's a reality. And so there are ways that you can make changes. You'll see this in some of these programs. It's similar to deductions in the taxation system, where you say you have an earned income deduction, meaning that if you continue to work, we will not count all of your income because we're incentivizing the things that we want to see. That's a part of the poverty math. I'll give you an example that I thought was interesting because it's contradictory to what we want to see in our communities. And one of the things is that if you're in subsidized housing and your income is counted and you send a child off to college, if that child tries to come back and move in with you and gets a job, their whole income is counted. And then it might lead to you not qualifying for the housing you have, but you know your child would not be able to rent anywhere else. And sometimes in some of these areas, that is the exact example you would want to see for the young people coming up next. You would want to see someone who goes off, gets an education, gets training, comes back, and is that lived example. And so those are some of the ways in poverty math, as I talk about it, that we should consider. There are technical administrative changes to incentivize the exact things that we want to see. And if you think about it, there are some programs that are rooted in community that can't be triggered unless there is more income. So if you look at the Community Reinvestment Act with banks, and the requirement that they have to invest in neighborhoods, well, they're only going to invest in neighborhoods or have a bank in the neighborhood if the neighbors have money to store in the bank. And so we're saying, well, where can we seed fund that naturally? I'm like, well, let these kids come home. Give them a deduction. Let them spend their money in the local neighborhood. Let them be an example. And that is exactly what we would try to see. And that's the type of anti-displacement, non-gentrification that's naturally occurring. So, I'll pause right there because I don't want to go too far down that path. But, just a couple more things. I think a lot of people, and I mentioned this earlier, are a lot closer to missing a paycheck or to an eviction, or, there are things that influence how they're going to live their life: transportation loss, job instability, family instability. Sometimes that leads to homelessness. Sometimes some middle-class families have some cushions. Oftentimes they don't, right? They've run through them. Poor families usually often have timelines They have a little bit of time, but not a lot of time. And we know employment matters a lot, but we're seeing the employment trends go up, down. And so those are a part of the things that we watch incredibly, but I know they're felt by our communities. And I do want to call that out, that we see
Yeah.
that when we understand.
How do, and you may not have the answer to this question, but how do we fix that? I mean, is this something that could be fixed at the local level? Does it have to be fixed at the state level? Does it have to be fixed at the federal level? That some of these, I mean, there's some things we can't control, right? The economy, gas prices are high right now,
Mhm.
which just, disproportionately affects people who have to drive to work and now have to drive further, and it's costing them more money and those kinds of things. But some of these other policy issues
Mhm.
that prevent people from working overtime because then they might lose something that's not permanent, blah, blah, blah. How do we fix those things?
Yeah. I had a college professor and I was in a leadership course and he says, start where you're at. So, what I would say to anyone is write the list of things that you care about and go to your local groups because usually there is an administrative policy and it indicates how the rules are applied. And we start there to say, can the rules be changed in a way that allows individuals to have smarter implementation of their resources and stabilization. That's where I would start. Anything can be fixed if we're willing to face it. And I think from where you're at, because some people say, hey, we have to go up to the federal government, then we have to go up to the state government, then we have to go to the regional government, then we have to go to the county, then we have to go to the city, then we have to go to the jurisdiction, then we have to go to the neighborhood. And what I say is yes, and start where you're at. Start where you're at, right? So, because otherwise it'll feel so overwhelming that you might get in a level of stasis where you're like, this is too much. Like, I don't know where to start. And I say, let's simplify that. Start where you're at. And that could look like a neighborhood association and ask the hard questions. I get a lot of the hard questions a lot of times. And what I've come to focus on is before I ask for more dollars, let's see where we're having the efficiencies in the system now. Because I want to show to you as you invest with your taxation dollars, here's where I use them, here's where we use them, here's where we saw the benefit, here's where we did not see the benefit, so we might have to shift. And we always have to be innovating, right? So are there new forms of development? Are there new forms of systems? And then remember this, we all have a responsibility to each other. So if you're unhoused, you have a responsibility to your community. It's not just for the housed individuals to be responsible. You are responsible to your community as the community is responsible to you. And that's how we have a community. And I do want to call that out.
Yeah. And it sounds like the Office of Homeless Solutions, where you are coordinating with all of these different partners and stakeholders, is a good place to start because it is overwhelming. And even just listening to you list all of the different layers of government,
Mhm.
my heart was starting to pound. I mean, like, that's overwhelming.
Yeah.
But if there is a place where you can go and say, Cupid knows this, how to get the answers to these various problems and bring the people to the table, I think that's a
Mhm.
really good start.
Yes. Yes. I think you hit it on its head, right? So it's how can we build these coalitions? But you also start by asking the question. Remember at the beginning of this conversation, we said there are so many people. You ask individuals about homelessness, they will say, grab your drink of choice. I got some ideas. I have some thoughts. I have some disagreements. And no matter whether they blame the system, the person themselves, let's start from somewhere and find the solidarity dividend. So there's a book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And in it, she describes the things that are taken away because we think they affect someone else, and then finding the area that we agree with. And we start from there. That's the solidarity dividend. So that's what I look for, even with people who disagree with me. And I say, well, where do we agree? We agree that we want solutions because we think we can do better than people who are unhoused having to use the sidewalk as a sleeping quarters. And that's where we start. And then we say, okay, so what are some of these solutions? Where do we go from there? And, I know that there are a lot of working people and a lot of working individuals who support families, so they can't always contribute their time, their energy. They might not have the money. So I say, give where you can and start where you're at by seeking out the individuals who are engaging in these hard questions and roll up your sleeves.
Right. And you just talked about a book, and I think the way I actually found you was you had a LinkedIn post that talked about, or you listed the 12 must-read
Hmm.
books for understanding housing justice. So I
Right.
wanted to ask you about those books and why those 12? What is it about those 12?
Well, I think when we're talking about housing, I wanted to give the frameworks that have helped me understand how America thinks about housing policy, development, basically space and place, without having to break it down to like, this book is about transportation, this book's about zoning, this book's about infrastructure, environmental policy, tax policy. I said, well, what are some of the engaging books that help me understand over the last 23 years what it means to build community? And that was some of the books that I encourage individuals to say, if you want to have this understanding. And I find that when you're reading these books, it's inherently things you already know. It just gives you the technical framework. It gives you that jargon that people use. And then you'll go to your grandmother and she'll say, yeah, I remember that. And you'll go to your brother and say, oh, yeah. So that was the framework that I was using, because what I wanted people to leave with is an understanding that you probably know a lot more than you think you know, but there are some additional things that you could learn, and it helps you bring together a framework for understanding how we create space in the United States
Yeah.
and what
And
it's
create
rooted in.
house Yes, and create housing justice. And I wanted to
Yes.
ask you about what that means. What is housing justice?
Right. Well, for my framework, housing justice means fair access to stable, dignified housing, regardless of race, income, disability, or background. It also means communities benefiting from investment without that displacement. So we talked about how do we stabilize community. And the reason why is because housing is also an ecosystem issue. Housing connects to schools. It connects to transit. It connects to healthcare, lending, labor markets, infrastructure, and wealth creation, which is why previously I gave all those books, because when you're trying to understand that ecosystem, you're like, well, what is the ecosystem? And you can't solve homelessness while ignoring wages. You cannot solve displacement while ignoring land use. You cannot solve inequity without ignoring historical investment patterns. And so to get away from, individuals saying, oh, this is just, this ethereal framework that is a political narrative, I say, I look at this information, and as a practitioner, I have one goal. How do I improve your quality of life through housing and get you to your next step? Because I am a part of a throughput system, and I want to connect you from where you were and be a conduit to where you want to go. And that's the ecosystem that is a part of housing justice, that is a part of the book series, that can help you understand how can I be helpful? Because I think at the end of the day, so many people come and they say, well, I want to be a part of the solution. I know that there are narratives out there that we're so divided, but when you sit down with people and you understand their emotions and understand their history, I think there's a lot more that unites us than divides us. And so
Yeah.
I'm trying to create those, communities and move us forward.
And it sounds like there's just no quick fix to fixing a broken ecosystem
Hmm.
and trying to rebalance these inequities in the system. So I know start somewhere, start where you are,
Hmm.
was what you said earlier. But what steps, like if you had to prioritize the steps for fixing the broken ecosystem, what would your priorities be? What would your top like three priorities be?
Right. So if I'm trying to fix that ecosystem, and the ecosystem that I'm focused on is going to be, how do I reduce the amount of individuals who are going to be homeless? I would say prevention. Prevention is one of the most important investments we can make. It is less traumatic and less expensive to prevent homelessness than to resolve chronic homelessness later. The other thing that I would do is that I would look at rebalancing that system. And the system is the housing system and the way that housing is built. So looking at more housing supply, people say, and there's very famous researcher out of the University of Washington, and he will say housing homelessness is a housing issue, which I agree with. And he frames it in the frame of musical chairs, with us simply not having enough chairs. So building more chairs, more housing supply, faster housing approvals. So at one point, I had the pleasure of working as the assistant director of housing and planning in the city of Austin. And I'm not a planner, but I learned so much from planners. And it's the rules that we go through land use determinations to get anything approved. So there has to be faster housing approvals. They call it ministerial approvals. You can just do it. And there are frameworks. So a lot of counties and a lot of cities are looking at that. Better behavioral health systems, because, we see individuals having mental health crises. I know here in Alameda County and in parts of California, I was formerly in Santa Clara County. That's where San Jose is. You see a lot of intention there. And I love to see that. You'll also see tenant protections. This is all a part of rebalancing that system. So how do we help people stay in place? Economic mobility pathways. So we talked about that. You can't talk about this without talking about economics. And every day we're hearing more and more layoffs. So how do we have economic mobility pathways, anti-displacement strategies, regional alignment? And then the last thing that I would look at is the role of community development. So to reframe, it is prevention, it's rebalancing the system. And this third thing I'm going to talk about is role of community development, because housing is not just about units. It's about strong communities that also require parks, sidewalks, libraries, grocery stores, schools, banks, arts, economic opportunities, things like that that make our communities feel like community. So the three things that would be the top three things that I focus on would be the prevention, the rebalancing the system, and the role of community development.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, on the podcast, we try to clear up misconceptions or myths.
Yeah.
So could you give us an example of a misconception or a myth that is related to this housing justice phenomena that you've written about?
Yes. So I will reframe that a little bit to focus on homelessness, because I think that that's the generational issue of our time. And what I hear a lot is people want to be homeless. People, this is a decision that they've made. And the overwhelming majority of people do not want to live outside, by the way. They will acknowledge that they've made mistakes. They've made financial mistakes. They've made personal mistakes. They've made relationships mistakes. They might have even violated the law. But they overwhelmingly do not want to live outside. Many people experience homelessness are navigating traumas, instabilities, system failures, or distrust after repeated institutional breakdowns. And I won't act like I'm wearing rose-colored glasses. Sometimes they've done things that are antisocial, that we might not approve of. But even then, I think people deserve some form of shelter, because that is a community good and it affects us in ways that we might not even notice, right? So people also assume homelessness has one cause. In reality, homelessness is usually accumulation of pressures over time. And so though that would be the misconception that I would want to address and say, that's a bit of a myth. Most people that you talk to, they do not want to be homeless. They might indicate a lot of things that they would have to consider when coming indoors. But when you engage with them and you say, do you want to be homeless? A lot of them will say, no, I don't want to be homeless. Here's how I became homeless. Here's what's keeping me homeless. I want to be near community. I found it okay out here. I want to live off the grid. All things that you can do inside. Right.
Right.
But
Because
for the most part,
it's a hard life. It's
it is.
lonely.
Yeah.
It's and it I think it's the chicken and the egg, right?
Right.
Sometimes people do have substance abuse problems, but that might not just be the cause of homelessness, can be, but might
Mm,
not it might happen afterwards because it is
right.
such a stressful way to live.
Right. I no more to say about that. And I think that when you talk to lived experience individuals, they will say that from the top of their lungs, where they're saying, it is not a glamorous lifestyle. It is a hustle. It is. And, one of the things that I found out, and I'll use a data point that I know is true, is that when I was doing my prior work in the city of San Jose, 40% of those individuals were working.
Yes.
40% of the unhoused individuals had
Yeah.
jobs. Some of them were building the types of housing they needed. Um, and so you see a lot of, I've had partnerships with the Goodwill, and we've had jobs programs. And here in the city of Oakland, the mayor is leading an initiative to help get people reconnected to those financial resources. So I think once you sit down with individuals, you'll understand that some of these misconceptions are because we have a misconception of how the system is working right now.
Right. And it's not necessarily a personal failure. It's, as you've talked about and described, it's a very complicated and largely systemic issue that
Right.
pushes people into homelessness.
Right.
What new things do you have on the horizon? What new initiatives are you working on in Oakland?
Yeah, so right now we are operationalizing our homelessness strategic action plan. So that is a 5-year plan broken up in 1-year increments on how we are going to address this issue. Part of it is going to be financial. So there is going to be some fundraising involved. So applying for some dollars. Another part of it is continuing down the production pipeline, but that's connected to the dollars, increasing available housing supply and sheltering supply. And one of the biggest things that we're doing there is we have a goal of a 50% reduction of those who are currently homeless and they need shelter. So getting them into shelter. We're also working with Alameda County, so improving coordination with our county partner, strengthening our prevention system so you never go into housing insecurity in the first place, improving our outreach and encampment response coordination. So I have a great encampment management team. They're the ones who go out and they say, hey, you are unhoused, John, let's have this conversation. They try to offer you services. They see if there's any housing availability. And when you're willing to accept it and ready to accept it, hopefully it's there for you. And then, on a personal journey, I've written a book. I'm continuing my thought leadership around housing justice and poverty math. I'm working on a couple apps about called Policy Vault. And so I try to keep myself busy, but I think the number one thing that I'm doing that's on the horizon is sitting and listening to people. Listening to the elders, listening to the unhoused, listening to those who have experience that have no experience, to colleagues of mine, and just sitting in that wait. So hopefully, information comes from on high, and we can continue to create problems. We want better problems, right? We will continue to have things that we can improve upon, but hopefully they're not the same things.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Really, really appreciate you joining us today on The Bells I Hear.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the Bells I Hear podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the Bells I Hear and follow us on social media. We post all of our conversations on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. You can connect with us on Instagram and post comments or questions that we can address on upcoming shows. More information can also be found on Blogger and Substack. So many ways to learn about the issues surrounding housing insecurity. Please join us and contribute to the conversation.